Welcome again, everybody. I'm Steve Coll, the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism here at Columbia. I'd like to welcome you to the 2017 John Chancellor Award Ceremony. And on behalf of all of the Washington Post folks, past and present, glad we could get together for this reunion on a very happy occasion. The Chancellor Award was established in 1995 by Ira A. Lippman, who is the founder and chairman emeritus of Guardsmark, one of the largest private security firms in the world. The award honors the legacy of one of the great broadcast journalists of our country, John Chancellor. And I'd like to welcome Ira Lippman, who's sitting here at table 1 with his hand up. Thank you, Ira, for all of your vision and your support for journalism that matters. We have some past winners of the Chancellor Award with us today. Welcome back John Kiffner, Andy Revkin, and Jim Wooten. And I'd also like to thank members of the Chancellor Award Selection Committee for their time and their stewardship of this prize. When Ira brought the John Chancellor Award to Columbia in 2005. He also created the John Chancellor Scholarship at Columbia, and since then, 15 students with outstanding academic achievement and leadership qualities have received this scholarship, and it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Chancellor Scholar, Isabella Dias. Hey, Isabella. So Isabella is a Brazilian journalist from Rio de Janeiro who's worked as a content producer, digital producer at Globo, one of the world's largest media companies. And as a freelance journalist, she covered the 2016 impeachment of Brazil's former president and the Rio Olympic Games, among other stories. In addition to her undergraduate degree in journalism from Rio de Janeiro Federal University, she's also studied at the Sorbonne, and we're very proud to have her in our class this year. So thank you, Ira, for generously supporting the education of the next generation of professional journalists. We're really deeply grateful. So now it's my privilege to introduce Tom Brokaw. He is the special correspondent for NBC News and a longtime supporter of this award, as well as our school. As we all know, Tom anchored NBC Nightly News for 22 years. He's written several best-selling books about the United States, including The Greatest Generation. He's a wonderful teacher. He's been very generous with his time and wisdom at our school. And he joins us today to share a few words about his longtime colleague, John Chancellor. Please join me in welcoming Tom Brokaw.
Good afternoon, everyone, and let me just say on behalf of NBC News, and especially one of the deans of NBC News, John Chancellor, how happy we all are that this is now an annual event. And Ira, who met John when Ira was a schoolboy and John was standing outside Central High in Little Rock, that legacy goes on, and every year we honor the kinds of people that John cherished, not just as his colleagues, but as his friends. John so loved presidential politics that I think if it were left to him, he would have amended the Constitution that we have an election every year. And then there are a lot of people in this country who think that's not such a bad idea right now, that we have an election every year. He loved the political culture and the arena and all that went through it. You know, serious historians of American politics and our political history go to Concord Bridge, and they go to Independence Square, and they go to Monticello. If you're a political reporter in America, you go to the Savory Hotel in Des Moines, or you go to the Wayfarer Inn in New Hampshire. You go to a place where Ronald Reagan leans in and says, "I paid for this microphone, Mr. Green." And Dan Balz was there at all of those events, and so many others since then. So it is kind of like civilian combat. You get a long, long list of battle ribbons, and no one has a longer list or a richer list than Dan Balz. And no one would be happier about this choice than our friend John Chancellor. One of the things that I always remember about John was his wicked sense of humor. He also, when the sun went down, liked to take a drink or two. And sometimes at the end of the evening, we'd wonder whether John was going to be able to report for duty the next day. But as they like to say in that trade, he could take a hit. One morning we were in Michigan for one of the debates, and I was still crazed with the idea of getting up early and going for a run, even though it was cold and snowy, and John and I had rooms next to each other. So I left a note under his door saying, "John, I'm out for a run. I guess you didn't hear the alarm go off." When I got back, there was a note on my pillow that said, "Sorry, Tom, I was at chapel." So it was those kinds of moments that kept us going with whatever else was going on. When I come to these occasions, I am so reminded of those events along the way in political reporting that we kept from the rest of the country as individuals because we didn't want them to know just how much we loved our job. My first political reporting job was in New Hampshire, covering Mayor Sam Yorty of Los Angeles, who had been propped up by the Republican Party to try to dent George McGovern. He was running as a Democrat in New Hampshire. I must tell you that there was nothing more depressing than to be a young reporter and have to chase Sam Yorty around from 11 in the morning until about 1 in the afternoon, and then he would be going down for a long nap in the cocktail hour. And then one day I saw one of my colleagues coming down the hallway waving a copy of the Los Angeles Times. His name was Bill Ames. He was from CBS, and we were both there to cover Sam Yorty, and he said, "We have had a second wind, Brokaw." And he opened it up, and Paul Conrad's cartoon was on the front page, actually on the editorial page of the paper. And it was a large, well-drawn portrait of a bunch of trees in New Hampshire with buckets hanging off of them. And then they also had on them Sam Yorty for President posters. And the caption simply was, "The sap is running in New Hampshire." And it gave us all enough energy and inspiration to go on for another day. So I'm very happy to be back in this company again, especially at this time when young reporters think that this is what presidential politics is always all about. In fact, we're here at a unique time. It requires more attention, deeper reporting, a sense of history, and a sense really as well, I believe, of a kind of perspective on where we are and not lose sight of that. That we are, in effect, too hostage to social media in America these days. Too many false stories coming at us from every angle, all day long and all night long. And to some degree, we are being judged not by the work that we do, but by the work of what I always think of as some guy in his underwear sitting in a basement who couldn't get a date for the prom, so he's going to get even with America by pumping out false stories on social media. That is as much an important part of what we cover these days as any presidential campaign, as any presidential policy, as any event that's going on in the Hill. We have to attack and make clear to our audiences and our readership just what has invaded the political culture of this country. Social media are an extraordinarily important part of the information world that we all rely on, but they can also be a destructive quantity in people who are reading them not knowing how they can get a strong, clear judgment of what's true and what's not. That is our role, and John Chancellor would feel that as strongly as anyone in this room would, and no one is better equipped to honor that challenge before us than the man that we honor today, Dan Balz. So on behalf of NBC News and John Chancellor, thanks to everybody for being here today. Thank you very much.
I'd like to start by thanking the Chancellor Award Selection Committee, which I'm a member. Thanks my colleagues, that is, for contributing their time and expertise to uphold the standards of excellence for the profession that this award celebrates every year in such a distinctive way. I'd like the members of the selection committee here today to please stand and be recognized. Nick Lemon, Mary Chancellor, Jelani Cobb, Ira Lipman, Michelle Norris, Lynn Scher, Bill Wheatley, and Mark Whitaker. It's a very serious group, and they take this charge very seriously. Unlike most other journalism prizes, this award honors sustained excellence over time, and it recognizes reporters who've shown a commitment through the years to covering difficult and complex stories. It honors journalists who consistently produce the highest quality of reporting day in and day out without compromise, and whose work has contributed significantly to the public good. Dan Balz is certainly such a journalist. He has been a keen reporter and analyst on American politics for several decades, and he's still at it, vital, essential, and clarifying. Year after year, he's produced great journalism while retaining also the decency and empathy that can feel elusive sometimes in political reporting. In his stories, as in his life, Dan is thoughtful, he's considerate, but he's also unflinching in his analysis, and he does all of that while remaining respectful toward those he writes about. He's universally respected among his colleagues and competitors, and he's really the preeminent political journalist of his time, and I'd even say part of the moral conscience of the Washington Post over the last several decades. So he joined the Post in 1978. As a reporter or editor, he's covered every presidential campaign and midterm election since then. In all, he's covered 21 national political conventions. He's the author of 4 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, Collision, 2012, and co-authored with Haynes Johnson, The Battle for America, 2008. Today, he's the Washington Post's chief correspondent, a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week, and a frequent guest on the Sunday morning talk shows and other public affairs program. He's just finishing up a term as a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School. So, Dan, what a thrill. Welcome to you and to your family, and congratulations. And I'd also like to thank and welcome all of Dan's colleagues and friends and family, particularly the large group that came up from the Washington Post and our alumni society that's here today, and I'm among them. I worked with Dan when I was a reporter and editor at the paper, and he was just unfailingly generous and constructive, no matter how high the pressure at the moment on deadline or how challenging the stories we were trying to wrestle into the paper. So I'd now like to ask all of those who will speak about Dan to join us on the stage, please. So Dan, this is your life. First, we'll hear from Roger Simon. Until recently, Roger was the chief political columnist for Politico. He's known Dan since the 1960s, when they were both undergraduate cub reporters at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And they got their start in journalism during quite tumultuous times, covering events like the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, protest marches in Washington. Roger grew up in Chicago. Over the course of his also very distinguished career, he's worked as a columnist at the Chicago Sun-Times, the Baltimore Sun. He was a White House correspondent for the Sun-Times and political editor at U.S. News and World Report before landing at Politico. So please welcome Roger Simon.
Thank you. When I first found that picture that you're no doubt looking at, I decided to call it Dan and Roger Go to College. Then I looked at it more closely, and I decided to call it two men in search of a mustache. Finally, I looked at it really closely and decided to call it, "If you see something, say something." The first thing I remember about Dan Balz is watching him work the phones. We were at the University of Illinois in the Illini Hall, in his tiny office in the basement, a somewhat bleak cavern that we dearly loved. It was where the student paper was produced, and Dan was pursuing a story. It wasn't a huge story. It was only a scoop in the sense that nobody else cared about it. It was the early evening. The light was fading. Our deadline was approaching. And Dan got out the student directory and the faculty directory and the local phone directories, and he started calling people. "Are you calling strangers?" I asked him. "I'm calling everybody," he said. He would identify himself as a reporter for the Daily Illini, and in pleasant but firm tones, ask them questions about matters that they really didn't want to talk about, but they did. Dan called one person and got one thread of the story, and called another and got another thread, and pretty soon he had the whole suit of clothes. Working the phones is a very common reporting technique. It is so basic, it is barely a technique. But to me, it was like watching magic. And Dan Balz made the magic happen. As sports editor, Dan had exposed a secret slush fund that funneled money from local business people to football and basketball players through their coaches. After Dan's story ran, the highly successful football and basketball coaches were forced to resign. There are things you can do at a Big Ten university to make yourself unpopular. You could close all the bars, you could abandon grade inflation, or you could get the football and basketball coaches fired. Dan was flooded with angry letters and calls, but mostly it was well-meaning people who wanted to know why. Why print a story like this? It was only going to hurt people, so why print it? The answer was not completely satisfying to them. It was news, important news, and we brought news to people so they could decide what kind of university and society they wanted to have. I have said many times that all the basics of journalism that I learned on that college paper. The journalism courses I took were valuable, but there was nothing like seeing journalism done and doing it. Dan taught me everything I know, but not everything he knows, which is why he's sitting down there and I'm standing up here. On the paper, we talked about our ethics and our mission. We talked about building a better community, a better nation, and a better world. It was the 1960s. We talked about how we were not just doing something significant, but something essential. And it all started when we were just teenagers, grim, self-important teenagers. That's partly untrue. We weren't grim. We were having a wonderful time. And a large part of the reason is Dan, or was Dan. I got to interrupt myself here to say, in writing this thing, I kept switching tenses because it was like writing a funeral oration at a person who was going to be sitting in the audience. But I'll stick with present tense for part of this one. And a large part of the reason is Dan. He is on a bigger stage today, but he is the same in so many ways. He's decent and honorable. He is somebody we all looked up to. He is somebody we all wanted to be. Dan grew up in Freeport, Illinois, a small town in the northwest corner of the state. It is most famous for being the site of one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. The debates for a Senate seat were really about slavery. Lincoln wanted to contain it. Stephen Douglas would let it grow. Lincoln was convinced he could get the public on his side. And Lincoln said during one of the debates, quote, "Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed." Lincoln also said that if his opponent should win and extend slavery, Douglas would, and I quote, "blow out the moral lights around us." And as we all know, without light, there is darkness, and democracy dies in darkness. You heard? No. Thank you, but I don't think I wrote that. It is 159 years later, and America still needs the women and men of the press who illuminate our lives. The illumination may flicker now and then, but it will not fail. It will not fail because of people like Dan Balz, who continue to shape generations of journalists by his example, an example that shines with the clear, bright light of truth. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll hear from Marilee Schwartz, who, like Dan, had a long and influential career at the Washington Post, primarily as a political editor. She was national political editor for many years. She was one of those editors who wanted everyone to be better, to get along, and to be on time. And she probably shaped more of the national political file in her years than any other individual besides maybe Dan, her close partner. She oversaw teams that included Dan and John Harris and David Maraniss in coverage that spanned 3 presidential elections, the last term of the Clinton White House, which is certainly a memorable one, and the first term of the Bush White House, equally so. So the Post hired Marilee in June 1979 as a researcher, and at the start of her career, Dan was her boss, and later she was his boss. And for those of us who saw them in both phases, it was kind of hard to tell the difference. So please welcome Marilee Schwartz.
I was so happy when Dan told me he was being honored with the John Chancellor Award. Like John Chancellor, Dan is excellence in journalism, and he honors this award. I've known Dan my entire professional career. His clarity, fairness, authority, and integrity has made him a role model to journalists inside the Post and outside. I am one of those journalists. As Steve said, I came to the Post as a young researcher, and Dan was my boss. Eventually, we were reporting colleagues, and then, finally, the natural order prevailed, and I became his boss. But my point here, I've known Dan as a boss and as the boss, and there's no difference. It's not about Dan. For Dan, it's about the journalism, the Washington Post, and ultimately the readers, and now television and web viewers too. Dan has adapted to the changes in journalism without compromising his mission or values. He breaks through all the noise and helps readers and the rest of us understand what all this politics means to us as citizens. And he often does it under enormous demands, election nights, debates, convention and presidential speeches, you name it. As Liz Spade, who was both of our boss, reminded me, on those nights, the one story we didn't worry about, usually the most important story, was Dan's. He produces great copy. He is, as Steve said, unfailingly generous to his colleagues, respectful of the voters and his sources. And no matter what the pressure, he does not whine, he does not panic. There is a civility, consistency, and stability that distinguishes Dan from the rest of us. And I have a story that makes that point. During impeachment, Dan was given the unenviable assignment of writing for each Sunday paper what we called the story so far. distilling from the gobs of that week's news what was important, or for that matter, not important. And mind you, during the week he was writing other stories. One Saturday I was in editing Dan's story so far. He and Nancy had taken a road trip. He called in to check if he had any questions. I told him no, he had done a great job, that I barely touched it, and the only thing he might notice was that I cut the first 5 paragraphs. He was silent. I heard the car pull over, and Dan said in his Dan voice, "Marilee, that's the lead." I told him I knew that, and now he had a new lead, and he wrote this one too, so we're good. There were sighs, some tension, a little negotiating. I restored a couple of graphs, and that was that. But I was a bit worried about Monday when he would be back in the newsroom. And even though this was Dan, it was possible he could still be upset. But this was Dan, and he didn't come in and say to me, "You're not on my team. Your editing made my story look like a monkey wrote it." Nope, he was on to the next assignment. And I thought, he really is different from the rest of us. But then, a couple of years later, he brought it up. And I thought, And then a couple of years after, again, and I thought, And then a decade later, hundreds of his stories edited by me, I am leaving the paper. I am being tributed. He is my tributor. He brings it up to the whole newsroom, and not without some bitterness. And I think, maybe he is like the rest of us, except, of course, he's better. Congratulations, Dan. It's been a privilege to work with you, and even more to be your friend.
Our next speaker also spent a large part of his career at the Washington Post covering politics. Kevin Merida is a senior vice president at ESPN and editor-in-chief of the Undefeated these days, an online platform that explores the intersections of race, sports, and culture. Before ESPN, and where he went in 2015, Kevin spent more than 20 years at the Washington Post, eventually as managing editor. In that role, he nurtured great journalism and helped grow one of the largest digital audiences in the business, and the Post won 3 Pulitzer Prizes while he was ME. He joined the Post in 1993. He covered politics, including stories related to the White House and Congress. He's the co-author of books about Clarence Thomas and Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. Please welcome Kevin Merida.
So I'm here to tell one story. But first, allow me a couple of warm-up shots. I am at a sports company after all. I need a couple of warm-up shots. I regard Dan Balz as a national treasure. And 2 reasons come to mind for me. One is consistency. To be great for so long, to be admired so widely by your peers, by Democrats and Republicans for decades in the most polarizing sector of our profession, political journalism is truly extraordinary. If Dan were in the NBA, he'd be LeBron James. If he were in the NFL, he'd be Tom Brady. Just consistent, record-breaking excellence. The second reason that comes to mind for me is that Dan not only makes his teammates better, he makes them feel special. Which is why if you want somebody to speak at your son's birthday party or bar mitzvah, or if you're getting inducted into your college Hall of Fame, I recommend you sign up Dan. Book him now so he can speak for you. He elevates souls and occasions with his combination of warmth and gravitas. And as my wife can attest, I've already gotten Dan's commitment to speak at what I hope will be a long-distant funeral. Not recently, not now. But here's my one story that speaks to the singular significance of Dan Balz. In 2011, I was national editor at the Washington Post, and Dan was on the national staff. And it came to my attention that Reuters, which was building up its Washington bureau, was heavily wooing Dan. Dan told me he was seriously considering their offer, and I was instantly consumed by dread. The idea of America's most respected political journalist, a Post institution, walking out the door, made for some restless nights for me. And a lot of people in this room, I know. It was a fragile time back then. At the Post, we were in the midst of an uneasy digital transition in the newsroom, engulfed by the unfriendly economics of our business, fears about the future, and a narrative, unfair in my mind, that we were not the same Titanic Washington Post that we once were, including our political coverage. And here was Dan, the glue, the wisdom, the guy who always inspired confidence, possibly bidding farewell. Nobody who heard or knew about this thought that would be a good look for us. But what to do about it? It seemed like the entire newsroom, not to mention many alums, some of them in the room, were volunteering to help. We wanted to show Dan some love, and so some of us brainstormed. And we produced what I can only be described as an instant classic. Campaign Crescendos, the election night writings of Dan Balz. Here it is right here. It's a 77-page collection of Dan's work from 1990 to 2010, with a foreword from former executive editor Lynn Downey and an epilogue by then executive editor Marcus Brauchley. So while we were producing this, Dan had gone on vacation to ponder his decision, and he was staying at our friend Al Kamen's lakeside home in Michigan. And we decided to ask the young homie, Phil Rucker, a Dan protege and Post rising star, to fly to Michigan and personally deliver this booklet, along with a basket of wine and other goodies. Now, Phil arriving at the door, I know shocked the hell out of Dan, but in a good way. And when Dan returned, we continued the conversations about trying to make him realize that the Post was his place. We talked about expanding his role, including with the new title, Chief Correspondent, the first time anybody had that title in the history of the Post, which really only made formal what he actually was. It also had the added benefit of giving him a cool new nickname that gained traction in the newsroom, the Chief, or sometimes just Chief. And Dan did stay, which we're grateful, and the wheels didn't come off the bus at the Post, which certainly was my worry at the time, including the steering wheel. Not only, I worried that not only would we have lost the compass that was guiding us, but that others would have left too. Maybe Phil would have left, maybe Karen Tumblety would have left, who knows? And that we would have struggled to lure top talent to a political team that no longer had Dan. And I can't overstate how important a moment that was that Dan stayed 6 years ago. I'm no longer at the Post, but I still believe what I wrote in a short introduction to this bestseller. We cannot envision a Washington Post without Dan Balz. He is who we are. On a personal note, I want to thank Dan for decades of friendship and counsel, and also for sparing me the disgrace of being the national editor who couldn't keep Dan Balz. I'm grateful not to be a bad Wikipedia entry, like the guy who sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees, or the guy who passed on Michael Jordan and picked Sam Bowie. So I thank you for that, Dan, for sparing me that humiliation. I love you, man.
Now it's my privilege to introduce Marty Baron, who hardly requires one, but he began his journalism career at the Miami Herald and the Los Angeles Times. After 20 years at the LA Times, he came to the New York Times in 1996, and then back to the Miami Herald as executive editor 4 years later, where he led the paper's terrific coverage of the 2000 presidential election and lots of other craziness in Florida at that time. He then moved as executive editor to Boston, where his instincts and talent for supervising really fierce investigative journalism led the Globe to 6 Pulitzers during his 11-year tenure as editor, including, of course, the coverage of the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church memorialized in the movie Spotlight. In 2013, Marty left the Globe for the Washington Post, where as executive editor, he has certainly steered that Titanic back to great vigor under the ownership of Amazon chairman Jeff Bezos, and we're all thrilled and proud of what the paper is doing this year in particular. So please welcome Marty Baron.
I hadn't met Dan before I arrived at the Post in 2013, but when I did meet Dan, I knew straight away that I had met someone who was a rare breed in journalism. Not just in political journalism, but rare in our entire field. Just read Dan, and you can detect that special quality as well. The quality he has in abundance, and that otherwise in journalism is in scarce supply, is wisdom. The ability to put events and personalities in perspective. The ability to recognize what's shifting beneath the surface. An ability to look back and truly understand how the present came to be, and an ability to look ahead and envision what seems destined to take shape. When Dan won the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting a couple of years ago, Dan said, "We are not horse pickers. It's not your job to pick who's going to win an election. Elections belong to the voters. When people see who won an election, they will know from the basis of your reporting why that happened." This speaks to another of Dan's greatest and essential qualities. He is a listener. At a time when journalism is full of talkers, in Dan, we have a listener. Because Dan knows that only through listening can you really learn. And as journalists, we must be constant learners. At his heart, and every day, Dan remains a reporter, not a pundit, which would have been the easy route for someone with his years of experience. A reporter. He is constantly on the road talking to people, real people, not just the political class. You'd think that during the current administration, you'd finally see Dan ruffled by the disruptor-in-chief. And maybe I did see that, because once or twice I saw Dan gently shake his head. And that's about it. Lose his temper? I never saw that. Use some profanity? He must have, but I didn't hear it. As I prepared to start work at the Post, I heard from Kevin about how he and others, and many others, had persuaded Dan to stay. And I know it wasn't easy, as Kevin just described. Dan had been a friend to so many in the newsroom, pretty much everybody, a counselor, and a model for how to do our work. And when I talked to Kevin about this, as you can now tell, he was clearly breathing a sigh of relief. Dan's departure would have been an incalculable loss. That he stayed has been an incalculable gain. Through the latest presidential election and the current presidency, Dan's is the sort of voice we most need. A voice rooted in constant reporting and rooted in an amazingly even temperament. You'll never find Dan saying something or doing anything he should not. People often say that journalism has lost the qualities of honesty and fairness and rigor and reasonableness. No, it hasn't. And the proof is right here in Dan Balz. Thank you, Dan, for being who you are and what you've contributed to our profession and to the Post.
Thank you, Marty. It's the tradition of this award to hear from someone outside of journalism to provide an additional perspective on the honoree, and we're very fortunate to have Peter D Hart with us today, a leading national pollster. Peter is one of the most experienced analysts of public opinion in the United States. He founded Hart Research in 1971 and since 1989 has been the pollster for NBC News and the Wall Street Journal. His political clients over the years have included Hubert Humphrey, Jay Rockefeller, Edward Kennedy, and Bill Clinton. And over the past decade, he's also taught courses on public opinion and public opinion research at Duke, Penn, and UC Berkeley. Please welcome Peter Hart.
Thank you very much. Let me just say there are two giants of journalism, John Chancellor, for whom this award is named, and David Broder, the legendary Washington Post reporter, who would be thrilled that Dan Balz is receiving this award. All three are sons of Illinois. And for Dan's hometown of Freeport, a little different from what you reported, it's a special day because up to now, their most notable citizens is the person who wrote the song, Who's Sorry Now? And the man who assassinated James Garfield. Fortunately for Dan, he embodies the personal and professional values of Chancellor and Broder. Even-handed reporting, which is never gratuitously mean, always based on the facts, and never diverted to the unimportant. Dan has an eye for understanding what the voters are saying and an ear for understanding what calls the conventional wisdom versus the way in which he can see ahead. For 30 years, I've had the privilege of being Dan's friend and source. And by the way, a lot of people said to me, God, you must have leaked a lot of numbers to be up here today. Dan was never interested in just numbers alone. He slogged with me across the United States since 2000 to garden spots like Aurora, Cincinnati, Charlotte, and York, Pennsylvania. And indeed, we went through one focus group after another that he went to learn what the voters were thinking and what they were saying. Dan's stories always caught what was happening and went beyond what the voters were simply saying, but signaling where the voters were headed. In 2008, he saw the potential of Barack Obama long before anybody else did. In 2012, he criticized the industry which I'm part of, a pollster, because what he saw are the faults and the shortcomings of what we were doing. And in 2015, he warned that 2016 would be a different type of year, that something special was going on out there. He could sense the uncertainty and the unease of voters all before Donald Trump or Senator Sanders got into the race. Dan belongs to what I call an endangered species. He actually likes politicians, he likes those who are in the game, and he is a person who respects the process. Even rarer, he actually listens to academics, and he recognizes that they are part of the political policies that are moving ahead and the movements that are there. My Republican colleague, Bill McInturff, said, you can trust Dan because he listens to your pitch and he treats it with true respect. You can tell the character of a reporter and how good he is at his craft by his language and his punctuation. Dan uses periods, not exclamation points. His sentences are unadorned. He lets the facts tell the story. It's rare that a first-person pronoun appears in his columns. And his columns are strong without being polemical, instructional without being ideological. To read Dan's columns on politics is a little bit like listening to Vin Scully call the Dodgers games. It's accurate, it's honest, and it's compelling. Like Scully, it seems so effortless because you know how much effort he has put into it. As Tom Brokaw said at the top of this show, the challenges facing our democracy, including the role of the press, are more daunting than they have ever been in my professional life. With the fracturing of the television media into ideological tribes, the need for balanced, careful reporting and deep analysis takes on even greater importance. In short, we need more Dan Balzes. Congratulations, Dan.
Thank you, Peter. And now I'd like to invite Ira Lippman to the podium to present the 2017 John Chancellor Award. Ira.
In 1957, the Arkansas National Guard was called out to prevent African American children from entering Central High in Little Rock. To cover the event, NBC sent a young journalist named John Chancellor. I became a source for John Chancellor on what was happening at Central High. John Chancellor was my insurance policy, my protection against the world's injustices. Through his reporting, John Chancellor dispelled lies and ignorance. For the first time, the new age of television journalism enabled the world to see the ugliness of racial hatred, and the result was a great advance for the cause of civil rights. That's why journalism is so important today and will be in the future. It is our first line of defense against those who would subject the world to lies and ignorance. By spreading light and truth, journalists have the power and influence to make the world a better place to live in, not just for a few, but for millions or even billions. But it takes courage, character, and integrity. John Chancellor had that courage. Dan Balz does too. John Chancellor is my hero. He was my hero at age 16, 60 years ago in Little Rock. And he is still my hero because he represented the truth. When he agreed to permit us to establish the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism, he envisioned rewarding the kind of journalism that would say to successive generations, this is the sort of work to which we should dedicate our lives. Dan Balz's work meets that test. He has championed the principles that make society more hospitable to both tolerance and truth. Dan, we honor the memory of John Chancellor by honoring your work. You have our admiration and gratitude for your contributions to journalism and society. In tribute to the life work of John Chancellor, I am pleased to present you with the John Chancellor Medal for Excellence in journalism and a check for $50,000. Dan, will you come forward? And ladies and gentlemen, will you give him a standing ovation?
Time to exhale. This is a remarkable moment. Thanks to everybody who's made this day possible. The selection committee, members who honor me with this, Mr. Lippman for creating this award in John Chancellor's memory and honor. All of the previous speakers, thank you for your embellishments. I'm not sure I recognized myself through some of that, but it was all pretty great. Thank you. No one receives an honor like this on his or her own. And so in my brief time here today, I want to spend most of it saying thank you to a lot of people. But first of all, a little bit of history. 51 years ago this year, a talented young journalist from Illinois received a first prize for feature writing from the Columbia Scholastic Press Association. She came to New York. It's her first time to the East with her mother to receive the prize. I happened to meet her a few years later. Creative, intelligent, compassionate, and beautiful young woman. She is obviously here today, my wife, Nancy. So you can see I am a half a century behind in receiving an award from Columbia. I can't tell you how much I owe to her. Thank you, Nancy. Our son John and daughter-in-law Erica Simmons were not able to be here today. Teaching and class schedules at this time in a semester are pretty inflexible, but their love has been a constant source of support for me. And frankly, the intellectual rigor that they bring to what they do and to what I do has always kept me digging deeper and working harder to think more intelligently. I did not know John Chancellor, but we share Midwestern roots, both of us from Illinois, both of us attended the University of Illinois. I met him briefly one time. It was in 1984. It was a few days before the New York primary. I was covering Walter Mondale's campaign at the time, and he and Teddy White showed up on the bus early one Saturday morning to make the rounds of New York. You can imagine what a thrill it was for a young novice reporter beginning to make his way to be in the company of that kind of talent. I can't say that we had a serious or even lengthy conversation, but I always remember the moment. They sat in the back of the bus, told stories along the way, and talked about trying to recreate this moment for themselves to learn more about New York. I understood at that moment that both were relentless reporters, even at that stage in their career, continuing to learn. Mr. Chancellor was the model for what a journalist should be. He was tough-minded, he was fair-minded, he was certainly courageous, and he was always in search of the truth. And those values are at the foundation of what we do, and frankly, to be mentioned in the same sentence with him is an honor I never would have expected. I want to say a few words about the speakers who you've heard from today. Roger is one of my oldest and closest friends. He and his wife, Marcia, and Nancy and I have been pals since we were together at the University of Illinois. Roger is a born columnist. He is a world-class journalist who writes with wit and bite, and he has extraordinary range as a reporter and writer. But his character, in the face of adversity in recent years, a physical disability that came on unexpectedly, is something I will never forget. His character makes his journalistic attributes pale in comparison, and to me, he has been a heroic example and friend. Thank you. Marilee and I, as she said, started at roughly the same time. She's been my boss, I've been her boss. When she became my boss, I knew my place. But I always knew that she had the back of reporters. I don't think there's any editor I've worked for at the Washington Post who fought harder for her stories, for her reporters' stories, than Marilee, and I suspect there are a few people in this room, senior editors, who can attest to that. Marilee also saved me, along with Steve Coll and Len Downey, from one of the perhaps most embarrassing moments of my career, which was the night of the 2000 election. I was writing the lead story that night, and it looked as though George W. Bush had wrapped it up because Florida seemed to be in his column, and so I was writing a new lead on a very tight deadline. It was ready to go on the press, and some combination of Steve and Marilee and Leonard concluded that we should never publish that story because something had dramatically happened in Florida. And they stopped, I don't know whether they stopped the press or yanked it off the press. Leonard later gave me the plate that went on the press with my byline on a story that would have been highly inaccurate. So I owe a lot to Marilee for saving me from that. Kevin Merida, as he said, kept me at the Post at a time when we were in a down period, frankly. And I was very tempted to leave by the offer of a friend who was working at Reuters, Paul Ingracia, who said, come with us for one last adventure in journalism. Without Kevin's charm and persuasive powers, I don't want to say I can be bought off just for a gift basket, but but when Phil Rucker showed up at our door, Al Kamen, who's here today, was also part of the ruse. We were asked to stay at Al's place late in the afternoon because there was a delivery coming of something that his wife was expecting. Phil showed up at the door. At any rate, I did stay. But without, I mean, I credit Kevin with so much of this, and without that, I would have missed the great renaissance that has taken place at the Washington Post over the last half a dozen years, and frankly, the opportunity to work with and learn from a generation of amazingly talented young reporters, some of whom are here today, many of whom are back on the beat in Washington. Marty came to the Post at a moment when our journalistic ambitions were in retreat. He immediately reversed course, set us in the right direction. He's been the right editor at this moment for the Washington Post, and I would say for the country as a whole. He is a role model for everybody in journalism, and of course he is a matinee idol. Marty mentioned the comments I made at the Toner Award a few years ago about not being horse pickers. The truth of the matter is that came from Peter Hart. Peter Hart taught me something invaluable when I was a young reporter and had first gotten to know him. And his point in saying you're not horse pickers was to say that there is something much more to political reporting than the mere prediction of winners or losers. And as he put it, the real goal for a political reporter ought to be this, that when people hear who won the election, they have an understanding of why it happened, that they understand the forces that were at work, why voters made the choice they did, and frankly, the consequences that come with those. And despite some praise for my occasional pieces that appeared prescient in 2016, I frankly think I fell short of that myself in 2016, and as I look back, saw some signs that I should have taken even more seriously than I did. The Post has been a wonderful home for me for almost 40 years, and thanks to so many people with whom I've worked and learned from. Dave Broder has been mentioned. Dave was a mentor of mine. I can't name everybody at all, but Bob Kaiser was very influential, Len obviously. I also want to say thank you to Stephen Ginsburg, who's been the political editor for the last 2 cycles. Stephen has been a confidant and friend, and frankly helped me make a transition in my own work and my own writing and got me through these very difficult years. This award is special to me for many reasons, not least of which is because I follow last year's recipient, the incomparable Gwen Ifill. It was a year ago today that we lost Gwen to cancer. It was a huge loss to journalism, and it was a personal loss to all of those, many of whom are in this room, who called her a friend. I know her smile shines down on all of us today. The Founding Fathers enshrined in the Constitution the rights to freedom of assembly, of speech, of religion, and of the press. And never in our lifetimes has a free press been more under attack and therefore more vital to a democracy. The story we're covering today is the most important story most of us will cover in our lifetimes, and we have to get it right in every way possible. Seeking truth, getting as close to it as we can every day, is more essential than ever. We must resist those who threaten to delegitimize fact-based journalism, not by argument, but what we are trained to do: relentless, careful, courageous reporting and vigorous storytelling in all the forms now available to us. That is happening in many places at this moment. We also must look at ourselves and ask whether we are doing all we can to understand the reasons why this country is as divided and angry as it is, and whether there is a way out. That too is often overlooked and underappreciated as we go about our daily work. It means getting out of Washington and New York. It means getting out of our comfort zones and away from the echo chambers that sometimes envelop us. It means checking our instincts regularly and sometimes breaking old habits. It means asking ourselves whether we are trying to answer the biggest questions on our beats, and if not, why not? John Chancellor would have it no other way. So thank you again, all of you here today, all friends and colleagues from whom I've learned so much and in whom I place so much confidence and, frankly, a lot of love. This is a wonderful day for me, for my family, for the Washington Post, and more broadly for the craft that we all practice and love. But there is much work to be done today and every day, so let's stay at it. Thank you.
Final congratulations, Dan. Thank you all for being with us. Have a great rest of the day. You're welcome to linger for a little while, but I believe there's another event coming in a little while too. So.